Good afternoon. I'm Michael Brown, president of the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's my great privilege to host this event in our Creative Thought Forum series. Before I introduce today's speakers, a couple of matters of logistics. Our target length is about an hour, given the size of the audience, which is now well over 300 and heading higher. We could go as long as 75 minutes. We'll be happy to take questions. If you have a question, you'll see in the panel, typically to the right of the event screen, you'll see a place where the questions can be typed in. They'll be processed by a staff member and sent to me. We'll try and avoid redundancies and so on. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions because this is a great topic. Another thing you should know is that given the tremendous response to our online events over the past year or so, we've created a new category of membership to accommodate people who know us only electronically. And there are, as it turns out, there are hundreds, if not thousands of you. So even though we invite you to join as members at any level, we'd be delighted to have you consider joining as a virtual member or purchasing a gift membership for just $25 a year. That will give you full access to our emails, calendar entries, and other things that will help you follow the events that we're offering. And we do have a very lively series of talks for the next several months. Your support, which by the way, we appreciate. There have been significant voluntary donations, and that's something we're really appreciative of. But your support helps us keep these online programs accessible and free of charge to a broad and diverse audience. Douglas Preston, an advisory member of SAR, advisory board member of SAR, is the author or co-author of more than 40 books, among them the nonfiction works The Lost City, The Monkey God, named by the New York Times as a notable book of the year, as well as the best-selling Pendergast novels that he writes in collaboration with Lincoln Child. He writes for the New Yorker and National Geographic and has taught nonfiction writing at Princeton University. He currently serves as president of the Authors Guild, the nation's largest and oldest association of authors and journalists. The article he'll be discussing today, The Skeletons at the Lake, was published in the December 14 issue of the New Yorker, and we'll have a link to that article in the chat box soon, as well as information on our virtual membership. Agustín Fuentes is professor of anthropology at Princeton University. His research focuses on the biosocial, considering the entanglement of biological systems with the social and cultural lives of humans, our ancestors, and a few other animals with whom humanity shares close relations. His current projects include exploring cooperation, creativity, and belief in human evolution, evolutionary theory, and engaging race and racism. His books include Why We Believe, Evolution and the Human Way of Being, and The Creative Spark, How Imagination Made Humans Exceptional. So I welcome Doug and Agustín to turn on their cameras right now. And I've asked Doug to begin by giving us a kind of thumbnail sketch of the New Yorker article, just to brief everybody who hasn't had a chance to look at it. It's great to see you both.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's really great to be here, and it's nice to be speaking to all of you, even if it's just electronically. Well, I'll just do a very brief description of the article. I'm assuming many of you have already read it, but it basically deals with the subject of ancient DNA sequencing, and it deals specifically with a really interesting mystery that has been known since the 1940s, when a forest ranger in India was way up in the Himalayan mountains, and he came across a small glacial tarn, about a 5-day trek from the nearest town, at 16,500 feet, amidst glaciers and just a very high altitude little lake. And surrounding this lake and on the bottom of the lake were the remains of hundreds of people, estimated between 300 and 800 sets of human remains. Not just bones, but also some artifacts. Flesh was often preserved, and skin, and so forth. And this has been a tremendous mystery ever since. Indian anthropologists have been fascinated with this, and they've sent a number of expeditions to the lake to collect bones, to figure out who were these people, what were they doing at the lake, and how did they all die, and when, what happened. And over the years, a number of research projects have gone, theories have been proposed, but my article focused on not just the history of the research at this lake and who these people were, but specifically on a really monumental project that was recently completed by Harvard Medical School, the Reich Lab at Harvard Medical School, and also in the Harvard Biological Anthropology Department, the Max Planck Institute in Germany, a number of organizations in India, universities and laboratories, and as well as other universities in the United States. So it was a massive, multi-continental, multidisciplinary study to figure out who these people were, what they were doing at the lake, how they died, and so forth. And it turns out that in the last 10 or 20 years, there's been a revolution in the ability of us to understand by looking at bones who people were, where they came from, what they ate in the last 10 years of their life, where they grew up, depending on the water they drank, and then so forth. So there's tremendous tools available, especially ancient DNA analysis, where we can now sequence the genes of skeletons that are 5, 10, 20,000 years old. In fact, we've even sequenced Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, and it's really, this is a very new science. It's only been in the last 10 years that we can do this. And so this massive study at Harvard and elsewhere determined, looking at a number of bones that have been collected at Roopkund Lake, that there were 3 groups of individuals who died at the lake in probably 4 to 5 mass death events. All of these mass death events occurred in the 7th to 9th century, except for one, which occurred in the 18th century. And this is where the researchers were truly confounded when they analyzed the DNA from this group. They called it Roopkund B. There were actually 14 individuals in this group, or bones representing 14 individuals, both male and female, found that they most closely resembled Greeks from the Eastern Aegean area, most likely Crete. And they dated back to around the 18th century. And so this is a tremendous mystery. Who were these people? What were they doing up there? How did they die? I mean, there's no history of Hinduism in Greece. And the article was not able to answer that question. The scientists were not able to answer it. It remains a mystery. But from there, the article that I wrote talks about ancient DNA sequencing in general and how this is overturning a lot of our assumptions about our human past and upsetting people. Actually, many of the stories, it turns out, we tell ourselves about who we are, where we came from, it turns out are wrong. And in some instances, this ancient DNA research is drawing back a curtain on some very dark, apparently dark episodes in human history. So anyway, I'm really delighted to be here with Agustín. We had a talk earlier. We've had a chance to chat, and it's just phenomenal. I think what the light that he can shed on a lot of these problems. I'm just really excited. I feel a little bit intimidated, really, because I'm just a journalist and he's, the PhD scientist. So I may be referring a lot of your questions to him, passing them off on him. But anyway, so that's where we are with this article, and I'm really happy to be here with Agustín.
That's a great intro, Doug, and I'm really happy to be here with you. And I don't know if anyone is ever intimidated by a PhD in the sciences, but hey, more power to us, right? So, following up on your overview and introduction, I want to also acknowledge how important it is to have journalists, to have authors write for a broader public about the complexities and all these sort of really interesting things that we in the sort of research and find and publish in peer-reviewed literature, right? If we're only publishing for ourselves, right, or other folks like us in the academy, our work is not doing what it's supposed to do. That is, translate into the world to help everyone understand what's going on. And so I think the Roopkund Lake issue is such an exciting one because it tells us about human history, human complexity, sort of maybe that things aren't the way we usually think that they are, and really challenges us even at the most basic level. When I first heard about this, and actually it was the original Nature paper, and I had a look at it, I didn't think much about it, but your article, your essay really pushed me to think, what were people doing at this small, teeny glacier lake, 16,000 feet up in the Himalayas? And I understand some were on pilgrimages, but obviously something else is going on. It's just so cool that this kind of investigation makes us just think about what does it mean to be human, and why do humans do what we do?
Well, that's a fabulous question, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you think humans were doing up there, or what your thoughts are in general about, because one thing, my article really focused on the physical anthropology side of things, and you are much more focused on the holistic side, you know, how anthropology, how belief, and everything else all works together as a unit. I think it's a much more actually interesting and more enlightening way of looking at some of these problems than just looking at the DNA and the physical anthropological questions.
Well, let me just give the shout out to the very basic morphology, the bones and the ADNA, which we'll talk about, because that's so important and it's such an incredible tool for thinking about it. But you're right, the bigger picture, right, is the most interesting one, right? But let's come back to the ADNA, because that's the little twist there. But the big picture is, so we know this Roopkund Lake, which is basically, it's a glacial pool that's about 50 meters across, right, about 16,000 feet. And it is, we know, historically on this sort of this pilgrimage route for a particular group of Hindu adherents on a particular set of patterns. So we know that people, and this is fascinating in and of itself, people climbed way up into the mountains, right, on this very difficult and complicated path because of belief, right, because of the way the world is for them and how they perceive it and how they perceive their interactions, not just with each other or with the mountains, but with the entirety of life, right? That which we can hold on to and that which we can't, which is just as important and just as real for humans around the world. So let's give credit or be impressed, as we always should be, by the lengths to which humans go just to sort of do what we do and connect with the world. So they're going up there, and this early, what they call the Roopkund A, which is probably the largest percentage of the remains of the peoples that are up there, are probably Hindu adherents who are on these pilgrimages. I say probably because we don't really know, but it does make the most sense. So then we get stuck with this fascinating other component, that there's this other group 1,000 years later, right? And was it the 18th century, 19th century, that are also showing up there. You know, the logical thing would be to assume, oh, here's another 1,000 years later, the same pilgrimage is still ongoing. And yet, you know, the ADNA and other things tell us these are not the same group of people as the ones 1,000 years before. Now, two things. One, I don't know why we would expect the same people 1,000 years apart, right? Aside from, these are high mountains, you know, in a very specific location. It'd be strange for people to travel incredibly long distances to get there. The second interesting thing is, okay, if these people have some sort of claim or some sort of heritage that's not in that region, what were they doing there? And were they on a pilgrimage, or was this something totally different? This is the exciting thing about archaeological or sort of human evolutionary or just understanding the human past. It's like people seldom read our textbooks and do what they're supposed to do. Usually they throw us curveballs.
Yeah, the curveball seems to be a very important part of human history. And, you know, I remember when I was interviewing David Reich, who's the head of the Reich Lab at Harvard, and he was saying that in almost every instance where they've done this ancient DNA research into looking at human migration and admixing, he's been totally floored and surprised at how humans got around and mixed a lot more than he ever assumed. And a lot of our treasured and cherished assumptions about humans and our ancestry and so forth turn out to be completely wrong. And as a result, and this is something I'm going to turn this over to you in just a second, but as a result, you know, his research has generated some controversy. And I'd love to, you know, Agustín, I'd love to hear from you, because you probably know quite a bit about this controversy. Where does the controversy come from, and what's it all about?
Yeah, that's such an important thing. So let me first sort of point out two things. I'm on two things today, but anyways, two things that are important. The first thing is, so it's not surprising that a geneticist or anyone is really surprised that humans have, throughout their history, done a lot of moving and a lot of mating with each other. Why? Because we have these cultural expectations, we're taught that humans lived in isolation, that human groups around the planet were really separate, and that when humans encountered each other, they always fought. So we know from the archaeological record, from cultural and historical records, we know that actually what humans do usually is move and mate. That we're all evidence. The human genome, if you study contemporary human genetics, it basically tells us one really important thing. Humans have sex with each other all the time, all over the planet, and have moved around. There's a bunch of other issues where they hit each other in the head and all those kinds of things. We'll get to that. But so what shouldn't be surprising, and yet it still is that the history of humans, even recently, right, is much more about movement, about migration, right, about people going one place and becoming sort of integrated into cultures, or changing languages and changing religions, changing farming practices, or, you know, so it's really interesting that is really what's happened. And that is in some senses in spite of some of our sort of assumptions, right? We assume that, like, well, people who are in, you know, France have been in France forever. People in the UK have been in the UK forever. People in, you know, Nigeria have been in Nigeria forever. Actually, that's not the case. Some populations, some groups have been there a long time, but in most cases, if you were to take a time machine and jump back for wherever you are on the planet right now, jump back 10,000 years to that same spot, the people would be really different, or they wouldn't even be there at all. So it's sort of exciting how we now aren't reliant just on archaeology or cultural history. We now actually have some sort of genetic assessments too. But the challenge is, frequently, the genetic information, the archaeological information, and some of the cultural history that we have don't agree with one another. That's where the controversy comes from.
Yeah, and it is. Well, let's take an example of this, a specific example that is just that I talk about in my article, and it involves the Yamnaya invasion of Europe. Most people of Western European descent are actually, their origins can be found in the steppes of Asia, or north of the Caspian and the Black Seas, and in the area of Ukraine and Russia and so forth. That about 5,000 years ago, a group of tribes there called the Yamnaya took advantage of two recent innovations in human technology, the horse and the wheel, and they abandoned their sedentary village life, and they became fearsome and terrifying nomads who moved both now Agustín may when I'm done with this, he may tell you that everything I've told you is wrong. So, you know, but they abandoned their settled village life, and they moved westward into Europe, and they also moved eastward into India, and they brought with them the Indo-European group of languages, which most Europeans and many Indians speak. And they also contributed a great deal of DNA to Western Europeans, including, in particular, the Y chromosomes that most males of Western European descent have come from Yamnaya, the Yamnaya male Y chromosome. The Y chromosome is only passed down from through the male line, which implies that this was not a peaceful diffusion or a peaceful movement of people, but it implies that in Iberia there was a 95 to 100% turnover of the male Y chromosome at this time, where the local indigenous Y chromosome was completely replaced by the Yamnaya-derived Y chromosome, which seems to suggest that all the men and boys and even infants were killed by the invaders, or probably in addition to the indigenous or local males were prevented from, were so suppressed in a way to prevent them from mating and from leaving children. And so their Y chromosome lineage died out. And so even though we don't have a huge archaeological evidence for violence in Iberia around 4,500 years ago, we have this genetic evidence that something quite profound and maybe quite terrible occurred. Now, it should also be noted that even though the Y chromosome was almost completely wiped out, the genetic lineage was not. Something like 40% of the local indigenous genetic lineage survived, which also indicates that the invading males took the local females to themselves. Didn't kill the women, but took them to themselves. What that consists of, what happened is, of course, genetics can't tell us, but the inference is it may have been a situation of mass rape or sexual coercion, and as well as female choice. We just don't know. But Agustín.
So here's the example of why science, journalism, writing, education, context, it all has to come together, because this is the perfect example. So I'm actually going to say that everything you just said is a hypothesis. It's actually a possibility, right? And there are data, right, to assess that. So let's walk through, like, how do we think about the past and how do we think about these kinds of things? So I think this is very interesting. The Yamnaya, fascinatingly, when we talk about them, we're actually not talking about a people. We've never seen them. We weren't there. We're talking about material remains and genetic remains. So I think that's something that we have to remember. We're actually talking about a bunch of archaeological digs where we found particular horses, particular pottery, particular artifacts, right? And these ancient DNA examples where we're finding particular genetic markers. So let's remember that, because the way it's most exciting to talk about them gives the sense that we actually saw this as a Netflix movie, right? That we saw this movement and all this stuff happen. So what we're doing is we're inferring from data, we're reconstructing. So let's actually take that. What's really interesting is there's a lot of archaeological evidence about these movements of peoples, right? There were cultures, material cultures around the steppes and what we call Eurasia that in this, 5,000, 6,000 to 4,000 years ago, did a lot of movement around and spread into a lot of South Asia, into sort of what we call Western Europe. So that we've got pretty good evidence of that. That's pretty solid, right? This is called the Yamnaya. There's a whole bunch of different names different archaeologists have given to them, but there's that cultural move. And then in the specific case, I think the really interesting one that you bring up is just in the Iberian Peninsula, which is now Spain and Portugal. But in the Iberian Peninsula, around 4,500 years ago, there's some really interesting indications that new materials are coming in, right? Some archaeological change is happening, which people always assumed meant new peoples were coming in, or the cultures there were adopting some of these new things. So it's not clear whether new people or just the materials came in or the people came in. But then we have this recent discovery of the commonality or the preponderance of the Y chromosome, right? So it turns out that in this area 5,000 years ago, we have some understanding of what the DNA looks like. And the Y chromosome, which is, yes, just inherited through the male line, shifts. Now, it's important to point out, we don't have all those populations. We just have limited genetic samples. So in some of the populations where we sampled, where people have sampled, the Y chromosome from a new group, not the older group that was there, is dominant, right? So that's the reality that we have. Now, here's the question. Was this a violent and horrific invasion involving whole-scale slaughter and rape? Or was this the merging of two societies or multiple societies over the course of a few centuries that reshaped the culture and the genome of the peoples in that area, right? And so there's the challenge. It's a less exciting story, but let's try this hypothesis too. What if this Yamnaya group, right, we're seeing them move through over about 1,000 years, spreading through and connecting with all of the groups that are there, where they exchange and they blend and they sort of settle. So let's say they come to these areas in Iberia where there's already pre-existing populations. These newcomers show up, and let's assume for a moment that they show up and the newcomers in the old group see each other and develop a trade network or kind of sharing of the environment. They share that environment, they start intermarrying, they start mixing their cultural and social systems, and that over time, the new group, the Yamnaya, begin to achieve, not necessarily through force, but maybe through trade or through their new agricultural patterns, they do really well and they achieve very high status. That status translates possibly into them spreading out and making more connections. And we don't know what the systems of marriage or mating or kinship were, but what if over that time we see an overrepresentation, right, of those Yamnaya in the subsequent populations in this area? That would look just the same with those Y chromosomes showing up. So for example, if you have a group of 50 people, right, of 50 people, let's say 100 people, of 100 people, 20 of those are, or let's say 20 are reproducing males. A new group of 20 males comes in. If they're all treated well, they're in a separate group. If they're all treated well, all of a sudden you now have 2 Y chromosomes in equal representation in the population. If this new group is preferred for any reason by women or just seems to do a little bit better socially than the old group, over the course of generations, they're going to start to slowly dominate. And so you go to 30 and 10, 35 and 5. And so what you could see is that through social changes, through hierarchy and valuation, you'd get a different genetic makeup. So the two scenarios, the one you described and the one I described, are both hypotheses. And then we just have to look at the data and see which ones are best supported, or can we even know?
Well, that's very interesting, because there was a study done in Colombia that was a very fine-grained genetic study that looked at exactly what you just described. And here's what they found: that the initial conquest of Colombia by the Spanish when they first came in involved rape, mass rape, sexual coercion, and some pretty horrific stuff. Then, for many centuries after that, the European males were preferred by the indigenous females. In other words, it appears that there was preferential mate selection, where those males of European descent seemed to have preferential access to local women over a period of centuries because of high status. It might have had something to do with skin color. There are all kinds of factors involved in here. I don't want to speculate, but because no one really knows. But for whatever reason, the males with a high preponderance of European blood of genetics were preferred by the local females, to the point where the local male Y chromosome was reduced to about 5%. And the European Y chromosome is about 95%, even though the people in this area are still, 50-50, 50% European, 50% indigenous. But the Y chromosome is very much out of balance with that. I mean, so in other words, everything happened. All the
Right.
hypotheses appear to have happened.
But I think it's very important to point out that the genetics don't work 50, it's a much more complicated landscape than that. And what you just described, we have to add another 2 levels to. One is preference. I think we have to be very careful, because whose histories are we reading, and what are the actual sort of social structural things going on? So, but let's back up for a moment. And it is true, when conquistadores and others came and committed their horrendous acts of violence against the local populations, it wasn't just the physical violence, it was also the introduction of a wide array of pathogens and diseases which decimated local populations. And so right even there, as that example I gave before, radical demographic shifts are going to change what the genetic landscape looks like, right? And so really part of this is a default sweep of some of these representations in the Y chromosome and other things, just because of the incredible harm done to the environment by and to people by pathogens. So what's really going on, as you point out, is this sort of multiple different kinds of things. But I don't want people to get the idea that there's European genetics and indigenous genetics and Yamnaya genetics and ancient Iberian genetics. These are all human populations. And when we're talking about the genetics, we're talking about one small piece of these complex layers of relationships, right? We're not talking about the economics. We're not talking about actually the social interactions. We're not talking about the hierarchies and the political systems. So all of that has to come together. But that's the power of the ADNA in dialogue with archaeology and anthropology and oral histories, right? So for example, in the case in Colombia, as in much of the Americas, what we frequently see in the academic world is missing so much of the oral histories, right, of the peoples who actually underwent this. One of my favorite examples is, when Mel Gibson makes a movie about the, extinction of the Maya without recognizing that there are, millions of Maya living throughout Central America. I think we need to sort of think about which bits of information do we need to be taking in to really understand these fascinating human stories. We have more tools now, right? We have more information, but I think we have to be careful in how we use it. And I mean, there's a lot to say about it, but it is exciting. It's an exciting time.
Yeah, that's very true. I remember when I was writing The Lost City of the Monkey God, there's a whole section of the book on the Columbian exchange, the pathogens that Europeans brought. But I focused strictly on Honduras, which was made an interesting case study. But what was very interesting was there's just so many Spanish accounts of the pandemic. It's horrific, and we have lots and lots of Spanish statistics. But I think there are only 3 or 4 contemporaneous indigenous Mayan accounts of what happened. And when you read those, God, it really gives you a whole different feeling. I mean, It is. I remember in one of them, there was the phrase, the author who was Mayan, and this was written in a Mayan language. He said, "The Europeans came and they withered the flowers." And it was such a powerful line. It was, and it was all about the withering of their. It was all about the illness, the sicknesses that swept through their community, and all the people who died. And I mean, the fact that the Black Death, at its worst, killed between 30 and 60% of the population of any given area. I mean, 60% was the highest. The indigenous people of the New World, the mortality rate was probably upwards of 90 to 95%. And when you
in some places, and in others not, but that's so huge, right?
Yeah,
and it's not the story, it's not the narrative, right? That's not in the movies. That's not in the sort of popular sort of description. And that part of the story, it's a missing, a really important missing element.
Yeah, when you think that the population, indigenous population, was reduced by 90% in some areas, as you just pointed out, that's a genetic upheaval, the likes of which the human race, the human species had never seen before. And so it's really hard to put back together what exactly happened genetically after that. It was like a watershed moment.
And here's something that's really important, right, about this. You know, it's back to the Roopkund, it's back to the Yamnaya, it's these sort of contexts. So talking only, you can see these huge events at the genetic level that may not actually have substantive repercussions at the behavioral, or that is in the sense that the way we understand how genomes work, right, how genetics work, we tend to think of essences, right? Like there's the European genome and the American genome, and that's not the way to think. You, I, and every other human on the planet share 99.9% of our genome identically. It's that 0.1% that varies. And so actually most of the swapping makes no difference. But what we can learn from it, right, is sort of rebuilding one piece of the story of human movement. And it's not all like this horrible examples and of genocide and atrocity that we just mentioned. We also get to see, you know, thinking about the recent work in the Americas and in sort of Western Europe, the movement of peoples over the last 10,000 years and sort of the connections across give this incredible sense of continuity of our species, right, and connections around it. And you know, archaeologically, we've seen this, but that's not usually the story we tell, right? And so it is interesting. It's easier to tell, and I want to ask you: is it easier to tell the sort of story about fighting and conflict than it is about people getting along? Do people find it boring when like two groups came together and they hung out and they exchanged some wares and they started farming and hanging out together? It just doesn't seem as exciting, but it's so much more the story of what happened.
Well, I like what you're saying very much. I mean, it's a very nuanced and complex view of human history, whereas if you just look at the, you know, extract the bad news out of the genetic research, you're really overlooking the fact that people loved each other, that they had families, that they traveled. I mean, one of the most beautiful things about human beings are their love of travel. I mean, for decades, for years, I have thought about those first people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge, coming through the ice-free corridor, which, you know, that must have been a really rugged, unbelievably, you know, outrageously courageous journey that these people made, walked into the New World. These were the real discoverers of the New World. Of course, we have no idea who they were or anything, but just think about that. They walked into the New World, they came out of the ice, and within a few thousand years, they were at the bottom of South America. They had spread over the continent, just like a blitzkrieg. Well, that's one theory. Not everyone accepts that theory, but it's a beautiful thing to think about human beings, their courage and their curiosity in seeking new lands. It seems to be built into our genes.
Yeah. Well, I love the way you just framed that, because that's, you know, when we talk about the Americas, unfortunately, particularly here in the United States, we use this colonial settler mentality, this Western frontiersman, this sort of, you know, evocation of a white supremacy wiping in manifest destiny across the landscape, when that's not really the hero's story about the Americas, right? As you just pointed out, the real amazing story is how humans over the past 10, 15, 20,000 years have been able to emerge into these new landscapes, into new complexities, to spread across these continents, to reshape them, to work with them, to engage them. And those are all of the indigenous populations of the Americas today. And those stories, which should be the big adventure excitement of the Americas, that's not actually, you know, what we teach mostly. I mean, some of us, but it's such an exciting adventure story. Like, why isn't that like, you know, what 9-year-olds learn in the history class? It should be part of it.
Well, it should be. I mean, Columbus's voyage was kind of wimpy compared to walking 5,000 miles through the ice to discover a new continent. That's really wonderful.
So this whole frame, you know, back to the beginning of our conversation, this lake up at 16,000 feet in the Himalayas, this lake that's 40 meters across, that's surrounded by, you know, hundreds of dead bodies, is a place that's remote, that's distant, But again and again, over a couple thousand years at least, right? Humans did that. They climbed those mountains. They walked for days. Like, what didn't you write about? Like, hailstorms kill it so horrible they would kill people out there. They exposed themselves to all these things for a belief, for a cause, right? For something that they held deeply. That's part of that whole Roopkund story that sticks with me, that resonates so much, is that humans are incredible when they believe something and they try to make it happen.
Yeah, that pilgrimage is the longest and most dangerous pilgrimage in Hinduism, and it's to honor the goddess Nandadevi, who is a manifestation of Parvati, who is the wife of Shiva, who is the supreme deity in Hinduism. And it is particularly the women in the villages below where this pilgrimage takes place, which this pilgrimage goes for a couple of 100 miles through the mountains. And many adherents walk with sandals or barefoot. I mean, this is a kind of trek that, today people have ice, with all the latest equipment, it's still difficult to do, and up to 16,500 feet. But it is this tremendous expression of belief and love of this goddess and it's the women who are the keepers of the information about the goddess. All the songs and stories are memorized not by the men but by the women. And for my article, I spoke to William Sachs, who's an anthropologist who spent all years with these women, recording their songs and transcribing them and translating them. And one of the songs talks about the wrath of Nandadevi when a group of disrespectful pilgrims were up at the lake. They were, enjoying themselves, and they had dancing girls and all the rest of it. And she was enraged at the violation of the ascetic traditions of the pilgrimage. So she sent down giant hailstones and killed them all. Well, when the physical anthropologists looked at some of these remains, these skeletons, they found that in a number of instances, the heads have been bashed in by what they think were large hailstones. So this legend that goes back to the 9th century actually was based on a real story.
And this is what I was saying earlier about oral traditions and about the sort of different kinds of knowledge. We so prioritize the genetic or the sort of academic, archaeological. As you just pointed out, and I was saying earlier, we need, as scientists, as storytellers, right, as people with the capacity to sort of, or the infrastructure to sort of report on these things, the voices of indigenous communities, the voices of women in this context, the voices of those who we don't often prioritize as equal participants in the construction of knowledge, of understanding about the history of humanity. We need to listen to them a lot more, right? Because all of this, the genetics, the archaeology, the anthropology, and just the people who are actually there doing the stuff that we're talking about, we really do need to listen to them. And it's all about storytelling, right? I mean, we all are telling stories. What we use to generate those stories is so important. And I feel too often we've cut out some of those critical voices. What the story you just told, I mean, that's so cool, and we wouldn't know that without listening. And we also wouldn't know it without the data from the skulls that were cracked open by the hailstorm. So all the data is good. We just
Agustín and Doug, the questions are starting to pile up. So before we get to them, I was looking at a sentence from Doug's article. He says, always well written, many anthropologists and archaeologists are uneasy about the incursion of genomics into their domain and suspicious of its brash certainties. Now, Augustín's already indicated some of the basis for that uncertainty, but I wonder whether it's partly the sort of lingering legacy of scientific racism, a kind of inherent, obviously going back many decades, but still there's this sense that genetics is a dangerous area for anthropologists given the history of the discipline. Is that a fair assessment, or do you think there's more to that or less?
I mean, I just got to jump in and say, look, I mean, yes, it's a fair assessment, but it's missing some of the picture here, right? So genetics is an critical, important aspect of how we understand the world, but it is not more true right, than other narratives or other ways or data collecting, right? It's another component. And the problem with a lot of geneticists, who I work with and have great colleagues who are geneticists, a problem with a lot of them is they're like, well, but this is biology, this is genes, so that is more reliable than archaeology or historical oral tradition. And that's simply not true because we interpret them. You know, that example that Doug and I were talking about the Y DNA, right? Both of those hypotheses, those narratives we gave, they're both possible and they're accessible by looking at the record. But the Y chromosome being more represented after than before, that tells us nothing without the context and the history. So genetics are really important. They're just not better than, right? They add another part to the story.
Here's a related question that comes in from BJ. He says, your talk raises the fascinating study of linguistics and how that explains migration and mixing of peoples. So how does linguistics play into this? Does it map onto the genetics well or not at all or somewhat?
Doug, you oughta?
Well, in terms of the Yamnaya, the linguistics does map very well onto the genetic information. And the theory of the diffusion of the Indo-European languages was proposed by a Lithuanian-American anthropologist and archaeologist back in the 1950s, and long before there was any kind of genetic, research. And she mapped the Yamnaya migrations strictly using Indo-European languages. And it was only very recently that the genetics has come to support that to a certain extent. I mean, to a large extent, actually. So.
And the linguistic sort of context is so important, but again, we have to remember what linguistics is, right? Sort of an anthropological linguistics is the sort of the study of the dynamics, the complexity, the movement and fluidity of language, right? So we can map language patterns and histories, but they're not static units like genes, right? And genes aren't static units that we think they are. And that's what's exciting is they show us these movements and histories, but again, they're just part of the story because lots of examples of languages coming in and being adopted, right? We couldn't tell if people replaced or if the languages just were replaced, but that's where the genetics helps, and then the archaeology and all those kinds of things. So linguistic analysis is really important, but I just caution the observers and the individual asked the question, it's all wonderful information, but remember all of this stuff is all laid on top of each other and intermixed. And so to say, well, this tells us the truth versus that is just not right.
Yeah. I got a different type of question, probably for Doug. Robert asks, how far below the pilgrimage trail is the lake? Could the lake itself have been a destination in its own right?
That's a very good question. William Sachs, who looked into that particular question, said that the lake itself was not considered holy, was not considered to be a destination. There was nothing special about the lake. The pilgrimage trail runs on a very steep, high ridge above the lake with frequent landslides into the lake. So the theory that he has, and I think this is true, is that the pilgrims were killed by weather or on the ridge above, and then their bodies were carried down into the lake through landslides or frequent landslides and avalanches in that area. And so that they actually didn't die in the lake or around the lake, but they died up on top, and then were over the centuries, these bodies were just swept down.
Frank asks, will you be returning to the main topic of the skeletons found over time he says in Nepal, but you mentioned in the article that there might be some interest in actually doing a serious archaeological project in that area. Is that moved forward at all?
Yeah, the problem is that the bones have been collected at the lake randomly, and that's no way the sampling is all off. It's impossible to say anything about those bones when they're just collected at random. So one of the bioarchaeologist I spoke to, who was one of the authors of the paper, said that it would be really a good idea to do a systematic archaeological excavation. And if you looked at the skeletons that are in the lake, you would find that, because the problem is that a lot of trekkers have gone up there, they've looted the place, they picked up bones, they built cairns with them, they've packed bones out and sold them. I mean, it's been a really a disturbed site. But she suggested that if you were to look at bones in the lake is frozen almost the entire year. Some years it's never unfrozen. You would actually find an area, you'd find bones that were undisturbed and also possibly artifacts that hadn't been looted and taken by people that would indicate where these people came from. I mean, this Roopkund Lake, by the way, for the last 10 years has been the #1 trekking destination in all of India. I mean, there are all these Indian companies that will take you up to the lake, and they're on a typical day, there might be hundreds of people up there. And this is not an easy place to get to. It's a 5-day trek. You really have to be in shape. You have to have certain level of mountaineering skills to get there. And still, it's thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people have visited that lake and destroyed the archaeological site there.
Louise Lamphere is one of our board members and a very well-known anthropologist, asks about Gimbutas's theories. As you recall, this had to do with the Yamnaya, the male-dominated warrior culture that overtook a more female-oriented culture. That work, those theories were not, I mean, I think they were pretty systematically rejected, and yet you seem to imply that there was some reason to revisit them. Is that correct?
Yes, that is very correct. Gimbutas was that Lithuanian-American archaeologist I mentioned, whose theories were pretty much rejected, especially her later work where she talked about the goddess society and you know, the Yamnaya brought this male-dominated warrior culture that, you know, invaded what had previously been a very peaceful female-centered society in Europe, or societies in Europe. But, you know, it turns out that the genetics do seem to align with her theories. And so they are being revisited, yes. I don't know about the goddess theory. That maybe is a little bit outre for archaeologists today, but the idea that the Yamnaya brought the Indo-European languages and maybe a culture that was more violent and male-centered is being revisited.
And I also just want to point out that there isn't archaeological evidence of damage to bodies, to bones. So this whole idea comes from some of the representative art, some of the materials, but that there's not evidence of massive slaughters or genocides or all those kinds of things in the archaeological record. So that's why I'm saying that, you know, the hypothesis it may be that there were other social indicators that led to this genetic swamping and what's going on. So I just had to throw that back in there. So I think it's not so much revisiting those old hypotheses, but looking forward and bringing all the new data to bear to recognize that this sort of overview and this sort of merging in is probably really important, but how it happened and what went on, I think that's still a big question. And I think we can know more now about it. So it's exciting.
There are several questions here that have to do with the skeletons. I'm not sure that they revisit some of the issues already talked about. So Peggy asks, given that people carrying variant DNA make a pilgrimage to the same remote spot, how did they end up dead in the numbers discovered? Well, I guess that's part of the mystery, is it not?
Well, it is. The thing is that a third of the samples that Harvard looked at were this European samples, and which implies, yes, good point. I should be careful about that because, again, these were bones collected at random. So we don't know. They might have just all been collected in one area, and these are all the people there were, but appear to be at least Eastern Aegean, some kind of the genetics matched those from the eastern region of the Aegean Sea. Now let's see. I lost my train of thought here.
Sorry. Sorry. I had to jump in because that's again this ADNA thing we didn't get to talk about. That is, so those bones from the 1800s, right, or 17th, 18th century, I forget, right in there, map to current populations in the Eastern Aegean, right? That's who they map closest to. Now, if you look at the actual spread, it's actually all over what is today, Iran and Turkey and sort of, Pakistan, Afghanistan. There's plenty of representation across there. So to say those are European is incorrect. To say that those genetically look like populations that are today present in that area is correct. So my gut is that these are sort of populations much more from that area of what at the time was Persia than the Aegean, but who knows?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there were theories. There was a very long Greek presence in India prior to the Christian era. There was an Indo-Hellenic empire which stretched, pretty much, off across most of Western India, and there were also Alexander the Great's soldiers. After Alexander the Great invaded India, he left soldiers behind and rulers, commanders who founded towns. And so there is actually a town in Pakistan, an area of Pakistan where the people claim to be descended from Alexander's soldiers. And some genetic evidence indicates that may in fact be the case. And that's actually the fact that inspired that movie, the book, the novella written by Rudyard Kipling, The Man Who Would Be King, that was made into that movie. But the Reich Lab at Harvard ruled all that out. It's complicated how they ruled it out, but they ruled it out. So these were not Alexander's soldiers, and these were not like an isolated population of Greeks surviving from the Indo-Hellenic kingdom or anything like that. They don't resemble any group in India, and India happens to be one of the most genetically sampled populations in the world because for various reasons.
There's a question that I haven't seen this come up yet, but it's something we probably should talk about, which is what are and especially given the sensitivities about working with skeletal materials in North America, Native American materials in particular, what are the ethical considerations that need to be discussed in relation to this project? I take it that the Indians themselves don't object to this kind of work, but please enlighten us.
It was done, right? Most of this work was done with Indian scientists in Indian labs in that kind of context. And let me just say, and Doug, the specifics of this case, but let me say that one of the serious errors of a lot of contemporary ancient DNA analysis is a lack of respect and a lack of engagement with indigenous or local stakeholder populations. That's changing. That is shifting now, luckily. But there is a large history of a sort of colonial extraction of this knowledge and its use. So that's something to be very aware of, and it's ongoing, but it is getting a little better because many people around the world, indigenous scholars, researchers, and stakeholders are standing up and saying, you can't do that. You've got to collaborate with us, and we have to set some of the stages. But Doug, you actually spoke with the folks in India doing this stuff.
Well, yeah, well, it's very interesting, the difference between India and North America. India, there really aren't significant religious barriers to the studying of human remains. And also Indian scientists are fascinated in learning about the history of the peopling of the Indias, where they came from, and so forth. So there's a lot of support for this. There are obviously some religious objections. But in North America, the history of anthropology and in archaeology in North America is really quite awful. Graves were dug up. Indians who were killed on the battlefield were beheaded, and their heads were sent back to the Smithsonian, to the Army Medical Museum that became the Smithsonian for study. So the centuries of really a scientific abuse of Native Americans is really haunting the profession now. Native Americans are really not interested they're much more protective of their dead, of their human remains, of respecting the dead, and of resisting science coming in and telling them who they are, where they came from, and all the rest of it. They quite naturally and justifiably resist that. And so North America happens to be, indigenous North America is one of the least studied areas genetically in the world.
But I do have to point out that right now, there are many indigenous scientists and geneticists doing incredible work, crafting and shaping the resource use, the sort of ethics and moral engagement, and the cutting edge science of genomics of the Americas. And so I think those things are changing as the sort of power shifts and the recognition and respect for indigenous communities is growing, but only because the indigenous communities forced the academy to do that, and that was what needed to happen.
And they control it now. The power is in their hands to do the research or not do the research, and it isn't outside, Anglo scientists telling them what, that this is who you are and this is where you came from, but they control the research, and that's really important. And it should, as you say, Agustín, it always should be that way. Going forward, that's the only way it can be done.
It's funny, Vine Deloria, as you know, is famous for when he was invited to AAA meetings. On occasion, he would give out forms to all the anthropologists, asking them to sign over the bones of their parents to a Lakota research unit. I mean, the funny thing is that my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, who got her geology degree at the University of Minnesota in like 1921, she was happy to turn her body over to science. So, I mean, cultural attitudes towards human remains vary tremendously from place to place. So there are a lot of questions here that repeat issues that you've already discussed. There is one that may not be entirely clear. So we don't really know the cause of death of most of the remains in the lake. Is that correct? Aside from the blunt force trauma cases you mentioned?
That's correct. They were able to rule out a lot of things, such as epidemics or pathogens. These were healthy people. They were by and large young people. It appears, without a lot of evidence supporting it, that most of them died of exposure.
Here's a question, obviously from one of your fiction fans, Doug. Quick question: did your research for this article take place while you wrote your most recent book with Lincoln Child? No spoilers, but the preserved skeletons in both of these stories struck me as similar.
Well, I'm always looting my nonfiction work for my novels, but I was going to go to Roopkund Lake. It was all set, and then of course COVID came, and it would have been a different article if I'd been able to go up there. The government of Uttarakhand has shut down a lot of the trekking up there because of the damage to the site. So it's being better preserved now.
There's an interesting question about the pilgrimage. If it's that long, doesn't it stand to reason that there would be other sites of mortality with bone caches, perhaps less disturbed than Roopkund?
I asked that very question. It turns out there are not. And that's a big surprise because the Roopkund stretch of the trail is one of the worst, but there are other areas where mass death could have occurred from sudden weather, and yet you don't find skeletons there. And I don't know why. No one really knows. No one has an answer to that.
Let's see, there's a question about whether the pilgrimage route would have also served as a trade route. I think we talked about the potentially, though it seems like an odd place to go and trade in general.
There's no route through it. The Himalayas, even though Roopkund Lake is only 35 miles from Tibet, there's no way to get from Roopkund Lake into Tibet unless you are unless you're going to climb the mountain Nandadevi itself, which is, it's just no way. There's no pass.
Okay, again, there's some redundant questions here, but so we're probably reaching the end. Richard Furlanetto asked, the mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA data points to an Armenian-like population. You seem to discount this, but as Dr. Fuentes points out, the Aegean DNA is actually widespread in the Turkey, Persian, Afghanistan area. This includes Armenia. Is that correct? Yeah.
Well, the David Reich was asked that specific question by an anthropologist, an archaeologist, and he said even though the Y and mitochondrial DNA point to Armenians, if you look at the whole DNA, it rules out Armenians. It also rules out the Levant.
But
Okay,
there's a debate about how widespread. So we can fine tune that argument, but that's a fine tuned argument. So contemporary Armenia per se is ruled out pretty effectively, but that spread over the last 1,000 years or so is still messy, and there's a lot going on.
Well, that's right, because you point out people moved around in the last, even from 1800, they moved around. I mean, 1800 was when the Greeks were throwing off Ottoman rule, and there was a tremendous amount of displacement of people and massacres and people fleeing villages. I mean, so all kinds of things happened that could have somehow, a group of people could have ended up in the Himalayas. Who knows? Yeah.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. Do you want to, Doug, do you want to start with just a closing thought, and then I'll go to Agustín? Anything that sums up this story? Will you be pursuing this kind of story again?
Well, there's one area that really fascinated me that I wasn't able to put into my article, was the concept of the star cluster. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Well, the Genghis Khan, it turns out that something like 16 million men in Asia are directly descended from Genghis Khan. So Genghis Khan has created a star cluster. This is what geneticists call him. Now, it turns out that there are other star clusters. For example, there are 3 million people of Irish descent, many of them with the last name O'Donnell, who appear to be descended from Neil of the 9 Hostages, who is a 5th or 6th century Irish warlord who must have been very, very busy because he left thousands of children. And Reich pointed out to me that around 5,000 years ago, there was a star cluster that was much larger than Genghis Khan, that originated from a male who lived in north of the Caspian Sea, whose name we have no idea, but who had accrued such power that he was able to have sex with thousands and thousands of women and leave many thousands of descendants. That's sort of an interesting subject.
Okay, we can look forward to hearing more about that. Agustín, what about you?
Yeah, no, I'll leave it with almost that same subject, that actually those genetic markers and indicators don't necessarily mean one individual had sex thousands of times and had offsprings. It's that a cluster of individuals or a group sort of spread out in that way. And so I think, and this is the debate, and it's a specific mathematical debate in population genetics, how you actually sort of disarticulate those things. So what's really interesting is that throughout history, you've had these sort of real expansive sort of moves, sweeps, right, of particular genetic markers. And in other cases, you've had multiple genetic markers. And so those differences between the sort of single markers and these multiple markers, what do they really tell us about the past? And here's back to the beginning of the conversation. You can't tell from the DNA by itself what's happening. The DNA always has to be in conversation with the historical, the cultural, the archaeological, and other evidence to overlay, to sort of triangulate what's going on. Reconstructing the past is just that. It's a reconstruction. And that's the exciting part of it, right? And that's why I enjoyed Doug's article so much, because it's like, it just gets you all excited about all these different things, and you're left with more questions than answers. And, until we get a time machine, that's going to continue to happen. But, more power to us, more things to do, and more hypotheses to test.
Well, Douglas Preston, Agustín Fuentes, thank you both for a very enjoyable and enlightening conversation. I look forward to hearing more from both of you. And I'd also like to thank our roughly 425 participants for your attention, for your questions, and I'd like to express my hope that you join us for future events sponsored by the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe. So we'll bid farewell to our speakers, and good night to everyone.
Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. Take care.